Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video, Alliance vs Horde Bias. Yep, that's what we're talking about, so yeah, what could possibly go wrong? Now, since the early days of World of Warcraft, Blizzard have been accused of showing more love to one of the two factions, often the Horde, though that has kind of flip-flopped until recently. We've got the allied race situation, and then even more recently, the Zandalari Druids situation. Yeah, who would have guessed that a bunch of mangled turtle, dinosaur, bear, devolved birdman, and strange dinosaur cat thing people would send the internet on fire? Well, I guess everyone. Dinosaurs are pretty awesome, and I can see why the Alliance are going through a bit of a period of dinosaur envy. But as much as I'm tempted to make a video about the lack of, Alliance dinosaurs or anything like that, let's do something that might actually be worthwhile and take a little bit of a deeper look into the issue. I think it's really easy to see why the perception of Horde bias could exist, especially historically. On paper, they are a really interesting faction. They've got a pretty damn wild backstory, and unlike the Alliance, they tend to buck fantasy trends. The Horde is really diverse, not in terms only of its appearance, but also the tone of each group. This naturally leads to more conflict and difference between them, which, for writers, is a source of pretty easy to tell stories. Essentially, the Horde are kind of set up to be easy to write. Now, the Alliance technically do have this too, but the Alliance races have always been portrayed as more of a unified front, and the differences between their races have rarely appeared in such a large way as they did for the Horde, apart from, say, Warcraft 3, where maybe the Night Elves were particularly brutal. That was a really interesting and compelling part of the Night Elves, and I'm a little bit sad that they seem to have toned that down in more recent years for World of Warcraft. But getting back to the Horde, their more diverse makeup is also reflected in their leadership. This means, again, really easy just fodder for creating stories. It's a little bit like how Star Trek The Next Generation really struggled in times because they were kind of under orders not to have character conflict. You contrast that with the high points of, say, characters in Deep Space Nine, where they were allowed to have conflict, and that kind of is an analogy for the differences between the Horde characters and their loose leadership, and how it naturally leads to some more compelling characters than what can sometimes happen on the Alliance side. Now, the Horde also benefit from having some very clearly defined themes that are also really easy to identify with, stuff like balancing strength with honor, overcoming what you think is your essential nature, and also just being an underdog. So let's contrast this with the Alliance. The Alliance are good. They're like justice and peace. They have historically in WoW had less conflict in their leadership. With the exception of then the Night Elves and the Draenei, their races also start off being quite close to their generic fantasy counterparts. This has all worked out a lot better in the novels and the deeper lore, but insofar as the in-game representation goes, well, say the WoW humans, they're not particularly interesting, and much of the Alliance is modelled after the humans. Now sure, the Night Elves have some really fun twists on what elves normally are, but as I mentioned earlier, they have strayed a little bit from their Warcraft 3 representation, which had them be a little bit more interesting, I think. In short though, historically the Horde has felt a bit more unique than the Alliance when compared to typical fantasy tropes. This balance does take interesting twists and turns as time goes on though, but we do need to consider that, what I applied here, it only maps onto faction-themed stories. There's a lot of faction-agnostic storylines that are different kettles of fish. Generic zone archetypes that work for both factions, like a spooky forest, an enchanted wood, a volcano land, that kind of thing. It's all sort of universal. But let's try to bring this into the current day, because what I just covered there, I think that covers a lot of the earlier accusations of bias, but what about the more modern ones? Well, the Alliance vs Horde elements of Wrath of the Lich King, Cataclysm, and Mists of Pandaria pre-Garrosh were all pretty damn great. Since then, Blizzard have focused on having us band together, or at the very least, they've diminished the narrative role of faction allegiance with the player characters. Why? Well, they've wanted us to deal with larger threats, with the Legion, of course, being the prime example. But here's the tricky thing about that. The Horde have spent much of their existence struggling not to be wiped out. Thrall only founded Orgrimmar after the main campaign of Warcraft 3. Well, at that time, the Alliance, in one form or another, had existed for a very long time, and then we have events such as the Alliance expedition to Outland in Warcraft 2. This resulted in characters like Alleria, Turalyon, and Khadgar, and then of course we've got the Draenei. Much of modern WoW lore is rooted in their history. This means that whenever World of Warcraft goes cosmic, that charge is being led by traditionally Alliance-themed characters. This is why much of Legion to many people felt like an Alliance-themed expansion, even though technically it does make sense that we all band together. And then doubly so because, in Argus, we're not acting as members of our faction, but instead we're acting as leaders of our classes. I suspect this is perfectly satisfying for many players, probably those who have a good knowledge of the lore and really keep up with that, but for players who only really, they don't pay attention, they more just pay to the lore and they more just care about the visuals, yeah, it's going to seem really Alliance themed. Now, is that the fault of those players? I suppose partially, but Blizzard have done a historically kind of weak job of the storytelling inside World of Warcraft because of the MMORPG constraints, but thankfully that does seem to be getting better. The issue that lies at the heart of this, though, is that the people at Blizzard who write the story have a deep knowledge of everything involved, but they are writing a story that is going to be consumed by an audience who, for the most part, they don't know the story that well, and they only engage with it based on visual motifs of each faction. That's naturally going to lead to a disconnect between the writer and the reader. I really do think that this is actually a large part of the problem for Blizzard. Now, from doing my own lore videos and reading the comments in those, I think it is abundantly clear that a lot of people have bounced off the in-game version of the lore. I mean, hell, even look at Noble's channel. How many games need a third party whose literal job it is, to actually explain the story of the game, which is a bit odd. But of course, also, it is a pretty damn expansive lore at this stage for Warcraft. Now, I think this will all be far, far less of an issue in the future, though. We have seen brilliant leaps forward in the quality of their storytelling in recent expansions, and I think Battle for Azeroth is set to be the best yet. Who knows about the plot, but certainly in terms of the characters, I think it will be great, and anyone who has read Christie Golden's novels knows how well she generally does handle characters. There's stuff like, say, the relationship between Anduin and Bane. That's a really good one, and we haven't really seen that in game yet. So as much as that might feel like a little bit of a tangent, I do think that that's a pretty key reason why we have an example of, say, something like Argus, where it does feel very Alliance-themed, even though on paper it really isn't. But let's skim through recent events. So one pain point is Blizzard not knowing what to do with the Horde, but knowing exactly what they want to do with the Alliance. Blizzard wanted the Alliance to come together around their king and be a united front. They probably did this knowing that they would then kill off that king and then replace him with his son, who is an interesting character technically. In-game, I think he really had problems, but with the full context of the books and the game, he's actually a very well developed character going into Battle of Azeroth, and I think he's in a pretty great spot, allowing his, resolve or whatever to be tested in a number of interesting ways and have him grow as a character. Plus, it's built off a father-son relationship for, this is a game that's primarily played by 25 to 30-year-old males, so it's naturally going to fit quite well. Moving on to the Horde, well, Blizzard seemed to have a clear idea what they wanted to do with the Horde in Mists of Pandaria, so the very foundation of the Horde was called into question, but they rallied around their founding principles and they secured a future for themselves. In doing so, they defeat Garrosh's ideals, which is much like how the Alliance sort of did the same in Varian taking the merciful option at the end. So, look at that. Themes, right? It's all quite well done. But after that, it seems like Blizzard really have struggled with the Horde. They spent a lot of time working on Vol'jin, only to kill him off and install Sylvanas as the leader by using, let's be honest, a very lazy plot conceit. It was spooky spirits. That's J.J. Abrams' levels of just using mystery to do whatever you think is cool in the moment. The real problem here, though, is we never really got payoff for that. So in Legion, Gen Greymane completed his character arc. He got vengeance for his son or whatever, but as the end of his arc. But it was only the midpoint of Sylvanas' arc which overall seemed to have been dropped. So I think it's no surprise that you'd think the Horde are getting the short end of the stick in terms of the narrative recently. But let's bring it forward to Battle for Azeroth without spoilers. More than any other expansion, Battle for Azeroth needs to strike a balance between the factions. It's absolutely core to this expansion even being able to work. Well, so far, my experience in the alpha across the 4 zones, because of that, I think they're actually doing quite well. Each faction gets 3 tailored zones, and unlike Legion, both factions get quite a lot to do in this expansion. We then have really cool faction cities, and so far the war seems quite even-handed. We also benefit from having lots of really well-developed characters on either side. Now, I've heard many people say that the Horde comes off better in this expansion. That's actually initially what I thought as well, but from playing it, I don't really think that's the case. Now, undoubtedly, the Horde do have some really cool stories in Zaldazar and Nazmir, but so do the Alliance in their 2 zones. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I do think that both factions have some major events that are really important. As for the continents themselves, well, tentatively, I actually prefer Kulturas as a whole. The world design overall is better in my view. It basically feels like one big, super immersive, cohesive area, while Zandalar does fall back in sort of feeling like 3 theme zones. Plus Zaldazar, it's actually kind of weak as a zone, even though it's a cool city with a really cool story. But the most important thing about Battle for Azeroth, though, is the quality of the storytelling for the main cast of characters. That's what's really going to matter when it comes to the narrative Alliance versus Horde stuff. When I look at either the Alliance or the Horde, I see great potential. I know there's a lot of skepticism about Anduin, and I get that. After all, I pretty much thought he was Wesley Crusher for most of my time playing the game. In some ways, I think his in-game representation still isn't great, but I think that'll improve. Some people worry about Sylvanas' leadership, but with the new direction on the writing front, I think they can pull off Manduin and make Sylvanas work. But all of that said, though, more importantly, and bring this back to the thing that kicked off this video, the Alliance doesn't have dinosaurs, man, so clearly it's an unbalanced situation. The Alliance sucks, and you should just play the Horde because dinosaurs are pretty freaking cool. So, that is it for the video, and this video is brought to you by you. I've got to say a tremendous thank you to everyone over on Patreon. We've been really ramping things up there. We've got early access videos, AMAs, whole bunch of stuff. Lots of nice BTS as well, and if you want to check that out and support the channel, because we now have a full-time video editor, which has been awesome, then you can check out the Patreon link down in the description below. But thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.